So a programmer from Naughty Dog, who is also working on PS4's ICE team, which is the team that works to improve the tools and development for the PlayStation platform, he has made some statements that sort of raised some eyebrows. So he stated that resolution and graphics are more important than 60 frames per second. And that's because, according to him, you can't see much difference between going from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Now, he made statements similar to this back in June when he stated anything below 720p 30 frames per second is, quote, unpleasant, but anything much higher isn't necessarily a clear improvement. He said dropping the frame rate from 60 to 30 results in a gain of only 16 milliseconds of frame time, and he would rather use that to, quote, make the game world significantly more beautiful, fun, rich, complex, awesome, instead of wasting it all just to make the game marginally more responsive to player input. But I'm not really sure how many people would consider jumping from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second marginal. So those statements were said back in June, but somebody brought up the article again just yesterday on Twitter, and they sent him a link and told him, you know, as a gamer, they were disappointed that a developer of his caliber would feel this way. So the PS4 ICE team developer responded back that for the gamer, with him believing that 60 frames per second was a lot better than 30 frames per second, was just the gamer's opinion. And so he went on to lay out the reasoning for his argument. Now keep in mind, this developer is responsible for working on the PSSL, which is the PlayStation 4's API for rendering a game. So this is his area of expertise. He says, quote, I agree that anything above 30 looks smoother, no argument there, but there's more to visual quality than silky smooth animation. More complex scenes, higher quality AA, less blocky shadows, more accurate physics, higher clip distance, and more particles, etc. Personally, I'd rather have all of that and more than smoother animation. If smooth animation is your #1 priority, then 60 for the win. Now he finished with, in reality, it's all about figuring out which trade-offs we think we can get away with, smiley face. So that's his opinion. And here's mine, that is complete and utter bullshit. Would you rather, as a gamer, have more particles on screen or less blocky shadows, or smooth 60 frames per second gameplay? Are you usually standing still in a game admiring all the fine little details, or are you usually moving? And also, whenever you're moving at 30 frames per second, you're missing a lot of those details. So you're actually getting a less clearer picture. The gameplay you're watching right now, click the settings and go between 60 frames per second and back down to 30. Which one looks better? And it's not just based on how smooth the game looks, it also means the controller inputs are translated to on-screen actions quicker. So, for me, it's always gameplay over graphics, especially in a lot of genres like racing, fighting, adventures, and shooters. So, I honestly don't get why this debate is still even going on about which one looks more appealing and what the majority of gamers actually want. Most gamers that I talk to say they prefer frames per second over resolution, over more particles, over better shadows. And I mean, I don't know why this is brought up, like why developers are coming out trying to play up the 30 frames per second as if it's better. Could it be that maybe 30 frames per second is trying to be played up here because recently games have been struggling to even hit a steady 30 frames per second on the PS4? We talked about that in the 1080p Zealots video. Just today, Digital Foundry released a frame rate test for Resident Evil, which showed frame rate dips down to 23 on the PS4 for that game. So, I mean, maybe they're trying to enhance other areas of the game to, quote, using his words, see which trade-offs they can get away with. So, of course, he isn't in charge of developing every game, so his opinion isn't going to be broadcasted across the whole PlayStation platform. But it does give you a revealing look at what is prioritized for some. Now, not all developers feel this way. Just last month, a developer from Xbox's Advanced Technology Group wrote a post saying that 30 frames per second wasn't enough. And so it's a pretty lengthy post. It goes into scientific reasoning for his argument. It honestly goes over my head. It's pretty technical. But if you want to check that out, I will leave a link down in the description box below. But personally, I don't need to read anything to see with my own eyes that 60 frames per second is a lot more appealing than 30 frames per second, especially in certain genres. But honestly, I don't need to read anything personally to see with my own eyes that 60 frames per second is a lot more appealing than 30 frames per second, especially with most of the type games that I play, with racing, adventures, fighting, shooters, whatever. 60 frames per second just looks a lot better on most games, unless you're playing some card game or something like that. And I do wish that more emphasis would be placed this generation on gameplay enhancements over a few extra particles and nicer shadows on the ground. To me, that just is common sense. But post below, let me know what you think is more important, shadows or frames per second. That does it for me, The Red Dragon. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.